And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I am joined by Dr. Jason Duncan. He's Professor of History and Catholic Studies at Aquinas College, and we're going to be talking about a topic that, well, frankly, I think a lot of us from a philosophical and political perspective thought that was in the weeds or annals of history and footnotes, but it's fusionism. So, Jason, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
Good, Marcus. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good.
Very well.
Good.
And thank you for joining us to talk about this. So, for the interest of our listeners, if they've never heard the term fusionism before, just give us a kind of philosophical and, if you can, also a bit of a political overview of the concept of fusionism.
Right. Fusionism is both philosophical and political, and its roots are in the Cold War, and there were conservatives who wanted to build a coalition, and basically included three wings of the coalition: economic free market conservatives, social conservatives, and those who were more for an aggressive foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And one thing that united the groups, and especially came to fruition under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, was opposition to communism. And this was a broad coalition. It came ultimately to fruition in the Republican Party, but there were certainly Democrats who were also anti-communist as well. And so the Cold War really served as a glue almost for this political thing. Philosophers would emphasize the ideas that it's two value sets or two or three value sets of belief in morality, traditional morals.
Which you typically get from your kind of classical conservative
right.
factions.
Yes, absolutely. And then those who emphasize, an unfettered market without state regimentation.
Overt libertarian view of markets.
Libertarian, pro-market, pro-capitalist, more anti-regulatory, anti-New Deal in some ways. But when the Cold War ended, the United States, had defined itself in opposition to the Soviet Union for decades. And when that ended, politics has really been without that sort of organizing principle. And I think both liberals and conservatives have struggled with it. Yeah. And conservatives, especially in the Trump era, if we can call it that, I think we can at this point, I think have emphasized nationalism, perhaps, at the expense of internationalism, like the Reagan coalition emphasized, fighting communism wherever we could. So that, in recent decades, it's really, like a lot of things since the Cold War ended, it's really sort of thrown American politics upside down. And the Democratic Party, as well, is going through changes. And increasingly it's becoming a socialist party in some cities. In this week's, yesterday in New York, three candidates in line with Mayor Mondami were elected, or won the primary election. So fusionism of the Cold War era, in terms of the panel, the future of fusionism, it isn't going to go back to the Cold War unless the Cold War comes back somehow. That's over. But it occurred to me, think about this, maybe it could be a domestic, anti-socialist coalition of people, including a lot of Democrats, who, while they believe in regulation and unions and economic equality, aren't really ready or never will be ready to adopt socialism as their organizing principle. So I think fusionism might have a future. It'll be similar to the past, but different. And that it won't be like a foreign power will be up against necessarily, but more internal struggles.
I was going to bring that up. I'm really glad you gave us that overview, because it's very clear, especially during the Cold War era and slightly after, and you think of some of the bigger names that were pushing fusionism as an ideology. You really get Francis Meyer,
right,
who comes forth with the concept of fusionism. But I think Warren Buckley was one of the bigger names as well.
Yes.
But from there, right, you see a kind of petering out philosophically, and then, like you bring up, it's seeing philosophical resurgence today.
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, the United States had to define itself in contra perspective to the USSR.
Right.
We don't have that problem anymore,
right.
So the U.S. politically and philosophically had to rethink itself.
Yeah.
And so now, rather than an external quote-unquote enemy, are we trying to redefine this movement based on an internal enemy of the potential of socialism?
It could be that. The Cold War did a lot of good for the country. It really drove the civil rights movement, because we just say to the world, well, we're in favor of democracy and freedom, except if you're black, and then you don't have those rights. Well, that was absurd, and people understood that if we want to be a true model for freedom, everybody has to be included.
Free, yeah.
And like the war on poverty, even though it has its hit and misses, Dr. Miller, who's just here, is an expert on that. But the idea that if our economic system is the best in the world, then why do we have such poverty in Appalachia and in our cities and other places? So the Cold War kind of kept us on our game in a way. And since then, it's been a struggle to know what we're about and who we are, what we're against. Islamic terrorism, for some, sort of met that role. But I think there's possibilities, and good possibilities. And it could be a new coalition that is more maybe centrist, because many Americans reject the left and the right. Independents are the biggest political group today, much bigger than either Democrats or Republicans. So, the age of, in technology and the digital age, Americans are increasingly kind of atomized and isolated, but maybe a new fusionism based on older principles can bring people together. That's one possibility around free market, but a regulated market, and other, traditional government, representative government, and not, radical revolutionary socialism, which I don't think most Americans support.
So we've been talking about this from a largely philosophical perspective, considering the political implications. For our listeners right now, why does knowing what fusionism is and knowing what its future is matter to, in this case, the everyday American?
That's a good question. Well, the everyday American probably never heard of fusionism, I would guess.
Unless you've picked up a history book.
Right, yeah. What would it meant? Well, I think in American politics, it's always been about coalitions. And that's, even in the country is more diverse today than ever. So coalition building is more important than ever, I think. But what do we build? What does one build a coalition around? And that opens up, fusionism on the left, fusionism on the right, maybe fusionism in the middle, the draw from the left and the right. Perhaps it would be the best way forward. But I think we're still going through a change in politics. I mean, the Republican Party nominated Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, in 2012, nominated a very different character 4 years later, Donald Trump, who has really remade the party in his image, as the cliche goes. And it's astonishing how quickly he did that, and how effectively he did that. And the Democrats, as I mentioned, are really moving pretty far away from the Bill Clinton pro-free market, even John Kerry, Barack Obama pro-free market policies, towards something
which we can all argue that there was a move towards a greater regulation by the Obama administration. Yeah. But even then, the present party right now is moving away from that.
Right. Moving, at least in the big cities, where Democrats are strongest, toward a avowedly democratic socialist party, which previously had minimal support. Mm-hmm. But they made the very shrewd political move of not trying to acquire power as a third party. Mm-hmm. That wasn't working. But doing it by taking over one of the two parties, the major parties. Although that's not happening everywhere, not happening all at once. But
you're certainly seeing the waves at the federal level.
Yes, absolutely, especially in New York, D.C., Seattle, Chicago, Boston a little bit, bigger, maybe smaller cities to follow, possibly, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Jason, I know you and I could go on, and I'm very grateful that you're not only speaking about this, but that there are people thinking about this, so that we can speak into this area and try to steer some of these ships a little right for the sake of the American populace. Yeah. Just very quickly, if people want to find out more about fusionism, but also more about your work.
I'm not published on fusionism, but I do have a book coming out next year from University Press of Kansas about the 1836 presidential election, the first book ever on that election. And one of the themes of the book is how Martin Van Buren, who is not a name you hear every day, put together a party which really was a fusionist party between, as he put it, the plain Republicans of the North, or Democrats, and the planters of the South. The tragedy was it's pro-slavery in a way, but it was sort of a limited view of the Constitution. So there's deep roots of fusionism that go before the Cold War, even, I would say. And in terms of, what was the second part of your question about?
Well, we're going to have to stop there, but we'll include your information.
Okay, good.
And information to reading resources in the description of today's program. We're talking with Dr. Jason Duncan, Professor of History and Catholic Studies at Aquinas College. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.